Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's event with forensic architecture and killing architecture about digital modeling techniques and how they can be used to reveal human rights abuses in the built environment. My name is Harriet Jennings, and I'm a co-curator of the Shaping Space Architectural Models Revealed exhibition, alongside Mathilde Savary and Vanessa Norwood at the Building Centre and Simona Valeriani at the V&A Research Institute. And the Shaping Space exhibition is the outcome of research by the Architectural Models Network and a collaboration between the V&A and the Building Centre, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the exhibition aims to reveal the role of physical model making in architectural and design practice, both historically and today. And it touches on the importance of digital modeling through projects including Forensic Architecture's Drone Strike in Miranshah. And the show also explores how modeling can expand or work beyond the architectural field, which is something we'll hear more about tonight. We're delighted that the exhibition has actually been extended until the 5th of March. So we hope that you can come and visit it for yourselves at the Building Centre over the next month. I'll now hand over to Vanessa, who will chair tonight's event and introduce our speakers, Sarah and Alison. So thank you again for joining us.
So yeah, my name is Vanessa Norwood. I'm Creative Director of the Building Centre. Thanks for joining us. We're at the Building Centre. Thanks for joining us online. We're thrilled this evening to be joined by Sarah and Alison. So Sarah Nankivell is the Research Manager of Forensic Architecture, an award-winning research agency based at Goldsmiths, University of London. Sarah is a graduate of the University of Toronto and the University of Cambridge, where her research focused on the destruction of heritage sites in conflict. Sarah joined the Forensic Architecture team in 2017. And this evening, she'll be discussing the methodologies through the lens of an ongoing investigation where forensic architecture's techniques have been used to evidence heritage destruction caused by contemporary conflict and environmental damage. Using tools such as spatial and architectural analysis, open source investigation and digital 3D modeling, the investigation explores heritage as a human right. Archaeology is a tool for open sourced investigation and the complex challenges of modeling the many layers of history, ancient and contemporary, at this remarkable site. Alison Killing is a journalist and architect who uses maps and data to investigate urgent social issues. She worked in architecture and urban planning in London and Rotterdam before starting her own studio, Killing Architects. Since then, she has produced and curated an exhibition on death and architecture called Death in Venice, carried out research into the reconstruction in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake, and developed Migration Trail, a mapped data visualization about migration in Europe. In 2021, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, together with Megha Rajagopalan and Christo Bouchek for a series of articles exposing the network of detention camps in Xinjiang, China. This evening, she'll share her Pulitzer Prize-winning research exposing the network of detention camps, built as part of China's campaign of oppression against Turkic Muslims. It is believed that more than 1 million people have been detained. Killing and her team used satellite imagery, architectural analysis, and eyewitness interviews to uncover the camp network and investigate what was happening there. Thank you both, Sarah and Alison, for joining us. And Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Harriet and Vanessa, for having me, and thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. Great. Okay, I hope that's working. Yes, so I am here to speak a little bit more about forensic architecture's work, and on one case in particular that we are currently undertaking in Gaza. I'll just explain a little bit more about what forensic architecture is and does before we jump into the investigation. So forensic architecture, it was as Vanessa said, it is a research agency. We're based at Goldsmiths, University of London. We were founded in 2010 by our founding director, A.L. Weitzman, who is a professor at Goldsmiths. Essentially what we do is that we undertake spatial research and analysis And we do this to investigate human rights violations, and particularly the spaces and environments in which they occur. And ultimately, the goal of this is that this leads to the production and presentation of spatial evidence for legal forums, courts, tribunals, public inquiries, and also for advocacy purposes, as well as for public dissemination through various channels, publications, and in museums and galleries. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about what I mean by all that, and how we do this, the methods that we use. So just to set the stage, the kind of necessity for forensic architecture's work really came out of the fact that contemporary conflicts were increasingly taking place within cities and urban environments, and that most civilian casualties occur in buildings, in people's homes where people work. And particularly also as these conflicts were happening, around the time that forensic architecture was founded, more and more so crucial evidence was coming out of those conflicts in the form of video, images, testimony from the victims and the perpetrators, location data, and this was all coming out on an unprecedented scale and being shared widely across social media and other networks. And because of this, we felt that it was sort of foundational that human rights investigations also had to adapt and develop to this new media landscape. And particularly, AL felt in his kind of, as these ideas were being developed, that architecture really had a role to play, that architecture was not neutral and was in fact political, and that as these things were happening in cities, in buildings, that human rights investigation and architecture as a field really had to fully engage with the challenges of new media and of participatory citizen-generated open source evidence, which is very often experienced, or sorry, rather produced by those who are experiencing violence, people who are reenacting their situated knowledge, and producing this evidence on this scale. And it's very foundational to our practice that we are always working first and foremost for the victims of human rights violations. And we do so, and this entire process kind of occurs through a process that we call counterforensics. And what we mean by that is that forensics has traditionally been a tool of the state, and it necessitates that the state is always going to have an advantage over the individuals who they prosecute and survey. And this happens in three spaces, which we call the field, the lab, and the forum. So basically the field, where traditional kind of evidentiary data would be collected. For example, if a police cordon off an area where a crime has occurred, they're able to gather that data in a particular way, and process it in a particular way in the lab, and then to present that evidence and to seek sort of justice, accountability through the courts, which would be the forum. We don't necessarily have access to that sort of data or those sorts of spaces. And so what we do is to use something called counterforensics, which is basically to do those types of processes, but in an open source way. So where we don't have access to the same field, we use open source material. We scan through social media, we speak to witnesses, we do kind of all of these different techniques. We basically get whatever materials we can get our hands on, which, you know, maybe video evidence, maybe images, maybe leaked documents, etc. And then we would process them using the tools that we have available to us as visual practitioners, as architects, video editors, software developers, all these different types of practitioners who make up our team. We use the kind of tools of visual investigation that we know best. So we're using the sort of principles and methods and techniques of design, of architecture, in order to process this data, to analyze it, and to try and put together a narrative about what has happened. And then in terms also of our forums and the ways in which we present our work, we also may not necessarily have access to a courtroom in order to present the work. Sometimes we do work with legal teams, and sometimes we have been invited to participate in legal processes, in citizens' tribunals, and so on. But we often don't necessarily have that access, or we may be, in fact, preparing an investigation to be presented for advocacy reasons. This is often why we exhibit our work as well. and why we use, again, kind of whatever forums we can access and whatever forums we can get access to in order to present the work and to make it public. And in doing so, we like to think that we reverse the forensic gaze back onto the very state agencies, the police, the military, that use those forensic techniques of surveillance, of tracking, pattern analysis that they use to govern or control civilians in the first place. And what we're trying to do is to find new ways of pursuing justice and accountability for human rights violations through scientific and aesthetic means. So this investigation that I'm going to go through, I'm going to play the video while I speak. And this investigation, we began this investigation in 2018. And we wanted to focus on this site because I think underpinning this is this idea that heritage is much like forensics in the way that it is traditionally a tool of power, a tool of the state. And it's very often a top-down process that pushes sort of political priorities, and very often it decides what we remember, what we forget. We think of heritage as a process in that way, in kind of remembering the past. What do we remember? How do we tell those stories? And what we wanted to do was to not only to, I think, conduct this sort of archaeological investigation, which was a new idea for us as a kind of agency, to undertake a kind of open source archaeology. And I'm going to show you very shortly what I mean by this, but also to kind of look at the history of this site in particular, which is the site in Gaza, which is, I think, as you'll sort of see through the investigation, we believe was really an excellent lens through which to understand the very complex history of Gaza and the very complex current condition of Gaza. So I'll start to play the video, which I hope the sound is off. So we kind of begin our story in the middle. We begin our story here, which are the bombings which occurred in May 2021, when Israel's occupation forces attacked the Gaza Strip. During this time, 247 people were killed. And this significant aerial bombardment destroyed, as you can see here, high-rise buildings, major roads, infrastructure, commercial areas, as well as sites of cultural heritage. And the bombs, particularly the ones that we're looking at today, impacted this coastline, which you'll see. Sorry, I had just paused the video to, I'll go back. Maybe I can't pause it, that's okay. They particularly impacted this coastline that I was just pointing to there, which is known for having archaeological sites. And we can see here, which will be highlighted in just a second, that it left visible craters along the ground here. And we happen to know, and then we'll show you throughout this investigation, that these craters we know to be near and on top of buried archaeological remains. So these are the craters here. This, despite the fact that under certain conditions, which is what this document outlines, I'll just pause it, that under certain conditions, this is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, international law dictates that such attacks against historic monuments may amount to war crimes. And as we begin to get into our investigation, we really wanted to tell the story of this site. It's really one of Palestine's hidden treasures and faces a number of different threats coming from different sources. Archaeological remains, such as the ones you're about to see, are being gradually lost to advancing coastal erosion, as well as facing a number of other threats, including from the aerial bombardment that I spoke about, as well as development and other things that we'll outline. So we're starting to see here bits of the coastline, and we began to model these and to find where they were within the coastline. And we used a number of different techniques to do so. Primarily, we used the archival materials from excavations that were carried out between 1995 and 2005, where a French-Palestinian team went to Gaza to begin to investigate these archaeological remains. and they uncovered all of these along the coastline, which, as you can see, those pictures, I'll just go back. Those pictures are from the present day. They were taken in 2018, 2019. And we can see where the coastline is kind of beginning to erode. And effectively, when those teams showed up in 1995, it was children from the nearby refugee camp who kind of led the archaeologists over to the coastline and to show them that it was widely known by the people who lived there that these remains were starting to be seen along the coastline. And you can see where they are. And particularly, there would be, whenever there was a storm, it would sweep bits of the coastline out to sea, and the local fishermen knew that you would be able to find coins and other kind of archaeological materials after any storm because they would be swept away. And these cliffs are very close to the Al-Shati refugee camp, which is the largest and densest in Gaza. And so we began to model this coastline using, we were working with people on the ground to take this video footage. And then we just started, again, this process of kind of getting whatever we can get our hands on. And this grid shows all of the different types of material that we used in putting this investigation together, which included photos and images from the ground. It included news clippings and things that we found on social media. It included satellite images that we had of the area over a period of time. And it also included this drone footage, which was taken by Ayn Media in Gaza. And particularly, we used the drone footage in order to begin to model the coastline. And we did this through a process that is called photogrammetry, which you can start to see here. So you can do photogrammetry either through images or videos. And effectively, if you take enough images around a particular object or landscape, you can build what is called a point cloud. And you can see it here with all the little points. And basically, you can begin to construct a 3D model if you take enough pictures from enough different angles. And so that was how we initially built the model of the landscape of the coastline. And then we started to look through these archival materials that we had, the reports from these investigations from 1995 to 2005 in particular. That man there is the lead archaeologist who worked on these excavations. And so another part of this process was going to meet him in his office in Jerusalem. And as we began to pore over his reports, we had a number of questions about the layout of the site and where things were located exactly and when they had been discovered, and beginning to build a bit of a picture, a sort of biography of the site. As in any archaeological excavation, all of these sites and artifacts are now buried for their preservation. And so we wanted to undertake this kind of digital archaeology to reconstruct the site, or at least what we know of the site and what they were able to find when they were conducting these excavations. So we used these survey photographs and drawings and all of the photographs which this archaeologist, Jean-Baptiste Humbert, gave to us. And we worked with him to try and locate these images and other data that we had. So here we started to put together the excavations. So this is the point where they began to dig along the coastline. And here at this first place, we begin to see the archaeological remains. So we have here houses from the Achaemenid or Persian period. And beneath that, there was an Iron Age rampart or defensive wall, which we can see here. It's those kind of steps to the right underneath the plan of the houses. And so we use these images in order to locate it along the coastline. And you can see that the way that we do that is by finding these visual anchors. So we have this archival photograph and we have the landscape of the site, which we built using the photogrammetry technique. And then we were able to match it up with that building in the top left corner of the photo, which has since been added onto, but acted as our kind of visual anchor. And from there, we were able to figure out where along this coastline and kind of amongst the rubble that's there now, this particular part of the site is located. So using these types of techniques, we then began to model the rest of the site. And here you can see the full extent. Using this survey plan, which was taken by the archaeologists, we have the Iron Age site down in the south, all the way up to a Byzantine era cemetery in the north. And then particularly this site inland, which will be highlighted shortly, is what is known as the city of Amphidon, which is a Greco-Roman city, as well as a number of Roman sites along the coast. Really, the extent of these excavations and these archaeological remains really, we felt, speaks to the city's kind of great importance. It was a very significant site. It was really a place of cultural and economic exchange, an important port on the Mediterranean, one of the most important. And so again, this is this process of reconstructing the site that we have based on all of these materials and locating these in space. This is the Roman city wall, which you can see here. And this shows again how we put it together. Of course, open land in Gaza is quite precious. Gaza is very densely populated. This is very nice. This is a photograph of Jean-Baptiste, who was the archaeologist, with this model that he made. It's a handmade model. And we also use this again to anchor these various bits of information within the 3D model and start to reconstruct where these things are today. Here we can begin to see the kind of depth and complexity of the layers here. What was really important in this investigation was looking at each layer sort of equally. And I'm going to speak a bit more about that a little bit later. But we wanted to see all of these layers, ancient through contemporary. This particular photograph was very important in locating the site. It's the only one that we have of kind of the overall site, because the rest of it is covered up by sand. And again, this open land being very precious, this particular site over the years, a mosque, which you can see there, a children's playground, and public sports facilities. All of these things have been constructed on the margins of the site, which serve the Shati refugee camp, highlighted there in yellow. And I think this really begins to show this amazing sort of sequence of continuous inhabitation, where the contemporary buildings are constructed right on top of the Roman city, which is constructed on top of the Greek part of the city. And so we then started to really put in the detail in the modeling of these bits of the site. So these are some Hellenistic era houses, which you can see are just below the Roman city. And all of these form this city of Amphidon, which was one of the most important ports on the Mediterranean, and which Palestine had submitted to be included on the UNESCO World Heritage List, although the submission has not yet been successful. So yes, we can sort of see the way all of these layers of inhabitation, past and present, are coming together. And so then we wanted to start to look at the contemporary condition of the site. You can see this. I think this is a lovely picture of these plots in situ. So then we started to look at the contemporary parts and started to match these up. We found these photographs on the Facebook page of the mosque. And you can see that we then start to see all of these layers together. And kind of each layer really tells a different story of lived experience through material culture and through the built environment of where people have lived here for thousands of years. These layers, of course, can now only be accessed through these types of digital reconstructions. And in particular, we can see here from these images that we found and videos on social media, this smartphone clip in particular, which was filmed by Palestinians during the 2018 Israeli military incursion, shows bombs landing around the site. And indeed, we then began to conduct a satellite image analysis of the site, which revealed a number of large craters, which were caused by other Israeli bombings from 2012, as you can see here, 2014, 2018, and most recently in 2021. Israel claims that they bombed a military target, but some of these craters, which are often many meters deep, are only a few meters away from these archaeological remains. And as I said, Palestine has submitted this as a UNESCO World Heritage List submission. It's well known that the site is here and exists. It's certainly well known by those who live near it. and they have actually directly hit these remains here. And particularly, these are very close not only to these archaeological remains, but to the mosque and to the residential areas of the Shati camp, which really, I think, makes apparent the threat that is constantly posed to Palestinian lives. This is a quote from the ICC about the importance of cultural heritage. So these bombings, along with overcrowding that's imposed on the occupied strip and the advancing coastal erosion, have really put this unique archaeological site under existential threat. And it also denies Palestinians their right to their cultural heritage, while archaeology cannot happen there. And so a kind of big part of this investigation, as I said, it was the first open source archaeology that FA has undertaken. And I think archaeology in Palestine and across the region of the Middle East in particular has very deep colonial roots. Colonial archaeology very much prioritizes certain periods of interest. I think the kind of more classical periods and also the biblical periods, the findings of so-called biblical archaeology have for some time been used to displace and erase cultures which are living on the surface of these remains. And so heritage preservation has, it is important, but has also often sanitized and decontextualized the sites and objects it aims to protect. And so a big part of this idea of doing an open source archaeology is to kind of reconnect the practice of archaeology with the daily realities in which it's located, and to disregard local knowledge, to prioritize, I should say, local knowledge, and to also kind of bring together the lived experience of those who live with the site and who live around it and above it, and to kind of, again, this idea of forensics and heritage having this parallel in terms of being kind of top-down processes, you could say, or perhaps tools of the state, is really to kind of invert this, to do a type of counter forensics and to use this type of modeling and this type of kind of locating and synthesizing all of this different material and information together in order to really counteract that type of top-down process and to sort of give priority to each of these levels and to show that this is a continuous lived experience of this site and to kind of also understand a bit better perhaps the contemporary condition of Gaza. And that is where we'll leave it and pass it over to Alison. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was incredible. We should say that if you have any questions for both Alison and Sarah later, please do send them on the Q&A. I'll hand over to Alison now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here. Let me just share my screen. So for the past three and a half years, I've been working to investigate what's happening in Xinjiang in northwest China. It's just to briefly introduce what's happening there. Since well, over the past few years, China has started this campaign of oppression against Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, and it's believed that there were over 1 million people detained, and it's recently been determined that what is happening in Xinjiang is a genocide. And yet, until really quite recently, the international community has lacked evidence of what was happening there. And so when we started in 2018, this is what we wanted to try and provide. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, Xinjiang is in the northwest of China. It's an autonomous region, and it's home to a number of indigenous groups, mostly Turkic Muslims, of whom the Uyghur are one. The Uyghur are the largest, but there are also Kazakhs, there are Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hui Muslims, Shibe, and then a certain amount of Han people there as well, which is the largest ethnic minority, the largest ethnic group in China. Xinjiang it's very, very rich in resources. So it has a lot of oil, it has a lot of cotton. It's a major exporter also of tomatoes to the world. And so that makes it very important to China. It's also in a geopolitically very, very important position. It's surrounded by about 8 countries in Central Asia, and it's a key point in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this attempt to connect China overland and oversea to the rest of Asia and to Europe. And it gives access to the ports in Pakistan, crucially. As I said, the people of Xinjiang are not ethnic Han. They have a distinct culture and they speak their own language. They're also majority Muslims, and they've had a couple of brief periods of independence over the past 100 years, all of which taken together the Chinese government finds quite threatening. And that's sort of formed the basis for the current campaign of oppression, which is taking place. Now, there's been a long history of oppression in Xinjiang, of discrimination in education and in employment, of intermittent crackdowns on the practice of religion. But over the past 10 years or so, that's really accelerated. So the first things that we really saw were this big increase in the amount of surveillance in towns around the region. This is a photograph of Kashgar, which was taken in summer 2017. I mean, you can see all of the cameras right down the street, sort of watching everybody coming and going, as you really can't even go into or out of your house without the state knowing about this. There would be checkpoints set up at regular intersections throughout the city. In some places it's every few hundred meters or so, at which people would have to go through metal detectors. They would have to provide ID cards. They may have to get their irises scanned. And it made the atmosphere both incredibly oppressive and just made daily life incredibly difficult. There were also then crackdowns on the practice of religion as well. And then in mid-2016, Xinjiang got a new sort of Communist Party boss, Chen Changguo, moved from Tibet, where he had overseen a campaign of oppression there, and came to power in Xinjiang, at which point quite quickly a detention campaign was instigated. What that looked like in the beginning was, sort of schools and hospitals, as well as any other large compounds that the government could get access to. For example, apartment buildings which were sitting empty, which had not yet been sold and occupied. These sorts of compounds being taken over and quickly being converted to become detention facilities. We would see that they would be barricaded with a lot of barbed wire, that guard towers would appear. And from about March 2017, there were rumours that hundreds of thousands of people had disappeared into these camps. Later in 2017 and into 2018, these camps started to become more permanent, and they started to take on the characteristics that of prisons sort of elsewhere in China, that they would have they would be much more heavily barricaded, that they would have these very heavy perimeter walls, guard towers. They would be built in concrete. And this image, which is in Artush, in this sort of southwest of the region, sort of exemplifies that. At the top, we've got one of the sort of makeshift early camps, and then in the bottom of the screen, we've got one of the purpose-built camps that was built later. Now, when I started to work on this subject in mid-2018, it was believed that there were 1 million people who had been detained in these camps, and yet, very few of them had been found. It was also believed that there were about 1,200 camps in existence, so that would be one in every township throughout the region, and yet only about 70 had been found. And so our team wanted to find the rest. I was introduced to this topic by Megha Rajagopalan, who is a very experienced journalist with a huge amount of knowledge about and experience of working in China. She had worked for Reuters and then moved to BuzzFeed to be the China bureau chief. And she had been the first journalist to visit one of the camps. And shortly after that, the Chinese government declined to renew her visa, and she had to leave China entirely. And yet she was still very keen to try and continue working on this. And so we met and we got talking, and we realized that we had a complementary skill set that might allow us to work on this and perhaps find the full network. We decided, well, my background is in architecture and urban planning, and it meant that I had skills with satellite imagery from that we could probably use to investigate. And satellite imagery was a good tool to use because we didn't need access to China in order to do it. Even for journalists who did have Chinese visas, Xinjiang was an incredibly difficult place to work in. There was a huge amount of intimidation. Journalists would get detained or followed, and their sources would be intimidated, which meant that it was very, very difficult to work there effectively. And Xinjiang is also huge. It's about four or five times the size of Germany. So even to be able to go there and to try and go around the region on the ground trying to look for these places, just the scale of the place would probably defeat that project. And so we needed to find another way to work, and satellite imagery could solve both of those problems. It could also give us a source of information that the Chinese government couldn't control. And that's a really big issue in China. As I said, that they already restricted journalists' movements very, very carefully, but there's also like very strict censorship of the Chinese internet. So it was crucial to us that we had access to resources like Google Earth and their free publicly available satellite imagery, and also the satellite imagery from the European Space Agency and the Sentinel program. So we knew that we had a tool that we wanted to use, but it still left us with the challenge of where we should be looking in order to actually find the camps. And we spent some time looking at a number of techniques. And then I read an article in Wired, which talked about something that was happening in Baidu Total View, which is the Chinese version of Google Street View. And what was happening was that in industrial estates in Eastern China, that objects, buildings were being clumsily photoshopped out of the street level imagery in a sort of very odd attempt, like perhaps an odd attempt at censorship, but a very, very blatant one as well, because it drew attention to itself so closely. And what I realized was that if China was censoring industrial estates in Eastern China, that they would almost certainly be censoring camps in Xinjiang as well. And so I navigated over to Xinjiang to have a look. And we knew that there was a small series of camps that we knew definitely were camps, because journalists had managed to visit them and confirm those places. And so I went to look at those locations, and I found that there wasn't any street level imagery available, but instead something strange happened when I looked at the satellite imagery. And as I zoomed in on the location, this sort of light grey square appeared over the location of the camp. And then I zoomed in further and it disappeared, and the satellite imagery disappeared, and I was just left with reference map tiles, which is the sort of the light grey sort of standard map tiles that you'll see in Google Maps or Apple Maps, where the buildings are just outlines and the roads will be just lines. And I zoomed out again to sort of check what was happening, and zoomed back in again, and the same thing happened. And I realized at that point that the map wasn't in fact broken, that there was something stranger going on. And so I went to look at the other locations to see what was there, and I found the same thing happening. And at that point, I realized that we had a technique that we might be able to use to find the rest of the camps, that we could map out where these mask tiles were across Baidu, and then go and look at those same locations in non-censored satellite imagery, such as in Google Earth, and see what was there. And in that way that we might be able to find the rest of the camps. And that is what we did. Mega and I joined forces with developer Christo Bushek, who has a huge amount of experience of building databases, of collating social media imagery and sort of open source imagery, and building the tools that allows researchers like us to analyze that effectively and to find out what was happening. And in that way, we were able to find what we believe is close to being the full network of camps. We found 348 locations, and that's sort of compounds. And within each of those compounds, there were often multiple facilities. For example, a high security prison, a detention center, and a camp. But, I'm going to quickly now show you one of these facilities and just show you what we found. So once we'd identified places that we thought were likely to be camps, we started to analyse them. And the first analysis that we did was by looking at the satellite imagery itself. This is a place called Detention. It's just outside of Urumqi, which is the regional capital. And this is the largest camp that we know of. So in 2015, there was really very little there. And then in March 2018, ground was broken on a camp. So by April 2018, like about 2 months later, we could see that there were already buildings and a compound taking place. And by October, this had been extended substantially with an entire new compound added. We could see features in here like these really thick perimeter walls, which are about 1.5 meters to 2 meters thick. And they're about 7 or 8 meters high, which we could find out by measuring the shadows and using a tool called SunCalc to work out then how high that object must be based on the shadow. We can see the guard towers like at the corners and at regular points along the wall. This is the entrance to the prison. It's the only entrance to this compound, and it's very heavily controlled. And then what we can also see is these blue roofed buildings, which we believe to be factories. Factories right across Xinjiang actually look very, very similar. They're steel framed buildings. They tend to have metal roofs, which are then powder coated in either blue or red paint to protect the metal. And that makes them quite easy to spot. We were able to verify these because sometimes through eyewitness reports, and then in other times because we would have satellite imagery taken sort of every few days or every few weeks that maybe even allowed us to see these places under construction and to confirm that they were in fact steel framed structures. If I go and look over at this part of the camp as well, we can see things like this entrance building, which again is that's the entrance to this prison compound. But we can see that this building here has this barbed wire passageway which leads to this building. So this is probably the building which is used for processing new detainees. And then another passageway leading to this building. And again, probably a processing block from which people are then taken to the cell blocks through here. What we can also see is that on either side of the perimeter wall, there's a layer of barbed wire fencing. And we actually went and got the Chinese prison building regulations, and they again sort of showed us more detail of what was, they could tell us more about what this meant. So we know that this is, for example, a medium security prison because it only has one layer of barbed wire on either side of the wall, whereas the high security prisons have 2 layers. We can also see things like this guard building and the bridge that connects it to the top of the perimeter wall. And this gives access to the walkways on top of the perimeter wall and to the guard towers. And we can see it's elevated because of the shadow here with the pillar supporting it. So let's go back to my presentation. So once we had found what we, I should say that we then, having looked at the satellite imagery and determined which places we thought were camps, we then used a series of techniques to corroborate further. So Mega did dozens of interviews with former detainees, many of whom were able to point out the places where they had been held. Sometimes they were able to point that out to us on Google Maps. Other times we were able to ask them to draw maps of the compounds where they'd been held, and together with a town or a county, we were able to then match that to satellite imagery and discover where they'd been held. We also used tender documents. There would be tender documents, for example, for a new central heating system for a camp in a given county, and often it would mention the address, which we could then go and try and look up on Baidu and see if we could find a camp that matched the description. We would find employment adverts for guards to work at the camps, and again, they often had addresses attached to them. And so in that way, we were able to corroborate quite a large number of these facilities. Once we had done that, we actually wanted to investigate this much further. And we did a series of things to look more closely at what was happening. So one of the things we did was to take all of the locations and produce drawings of them so that we could calculate the gross floor area of each of the camps. And then again, using the Chinese prison building regulations, we could reverse engineer the capacity of those places because the building regulations often give a per square meter an area, they give like a per square meter like amount of space per detainee, and by taking the gross floor area and dividing that by the numbers in the prison building regulations, we could work out what the likely capacity of each given place was, and also look at how they had grown over time. So we managed to calculate that the capacity of the network built sort of since 2016 was 1,014,000 people. And that doesn't take into account the prisons which were built before 2016. It's really only the current detention program. And what it also doesn't take into account is the overcrowding that the majority of detainees that we have spoken to have described. So it raises the possibility that the true number of people being detained is in fact much higher. Another thing that we did was to look at one camp in particular. And this camp is in Mongol-Kure County, Jiaozhou, which is in Li, which is in the northwest of Xinjiang. And the way that we started that was we started working with satellite imagery, which gave us a really good overview of what buildings were there, how big they were, all of the measurements, the heights. Again, we could often calculate from the shadows. Although we would also often get satellite imagery that was taken at an oblique angle, and we would be able to see the facades, and there we would be able to sort of count the number of stories and make a good estimate based on that. And in particular, what we were interested in was this building, which was a new, relatively small part of the camp that was built in late 2017, shortly after the detention campaign had started. So, shortly after the detention campaign had started, and as the current detention centres were really overfull to bursting, and we knew of 3 detainees who had been held here and had since had been released and had managed to move to Kazakhstan, and Mega did a series of interviews with them. And so what we did was to work back and forth between the modelling, which I did, and interviews that Mega carried out with those detainees to try and work out both what this building, what in fact this entire compound was like, and then also what exactly was happening inside it. So as I said, we started with the satellite imagery. We were able to get the full layout of the compound in that way, and also the facades of the building. We could see in the satellite imagery that there were these barbed wire pens in the yard, 2 of them, which we suspected were exercise yards. Based on the satellite imagery and the facades images, we were able to make a good estimate of what the structural grid of the building was, and also what the likely layout of the interior was, because we could also see on the roof where stairs let out onto the rooftop, so we could make a good guess at what the circulation system was. And at a certain point, we got as far as we could from the satellite imagery, and we needed to go to the detainees with questions and to start asking them, okay, look, this is what we've got. What was happening in these places, and how exactly did this work? So the first things that they told us, for example, was about this exercise yard, and it was split into several pens because each pen was used for a different category of detainee. That there were, in fact, 3 different categories of detainee, from the lowest security level, which is the people that we talk to much higher security levels, and to people who are like very rarely let out and were often kept in chains all day. And so they could tell us, that told us already a lot about the workings of this system. But we also had questions, for example, about how big each cell was. And so we could go to the detainees and ask them things like, how many windows did the cell that you were in have? And once they told us like, oh, well, our cell just had one window, at that point we knew exactly how big each of the cells were. And we could start asking more questions after that. So we knew that, for example, that there was a classroom in the place. These camps were initially described as re-education centres, but in fact, there was relatively little education going on. Many people who were sent there were highly educated and had absolutely no need of Chinese or like Mandarin language skills, and they didn't need to learn basic factory work either. In fact, this is a coercive detention program. And it was often the people who played key roles in their communities who were sent to these places, religious leaders, business leaders, academics, for example. So the idea that this was about re-education is just simply not true. But there were classrooms in these places where people were expected to go each day and to spend time learning Chinese Communist Party propaganda. And again, we could ask people, well, how many windows were in the classroom? And when they told us 2, we could estimate how big they were and what the likely layout of that place was like to be. And then we could start talking to people about, what was happening in the cells, and the model served as a really good basis to have that sort of discussion. We learned that from the prison building regulations, we knew that that each of these cells must have been officially designed only for 3 people, and yet the detainees told us that typically there were about 10 people in each cell. That they were lucky that they did have beds, although in many cases people there weren't enough beds for everyone who was held there. They could also tell us a huge amount about what their day-to-day life was like, that they spent most of their time sitting in their cells. They were expected to sit on plastic stools, reading from textbooks about Xi Jinping thought. If there were cameras covering each inch of the cell, and there were also microphones which could pick up anything that people said, so that if people were caught speaking their own language and not Mandarin, they could be punished. And the guards would often shout at them across a loudspeaker in the cell if they saw anyone slouching, for example. So this was just a very, very like tightly controlled space, incredibly claustrophobic. And in fact, that in itself exerted a huge amount of psychological pressure on the detainees. Yeah, I'll leave that there for now, and we can sort of move to, if you want to know more about specific aspects of that, I'm happy to answer more questions. I think it's also helpful to talk a little bit about how people get into this sort of work. I know that's a question that I get asked very frequently. Sarah and the forensic architecture team have a master's at Goldsmith, and I'll leave it to Sarah to talk about that. But certainly the way that I got into this was much more informally. I do have like a full architecture education. I did my part 3 and I worked in practice for a number of years, and that's given me a lot of the skills that I have in sort of satellite imagery analysis and in modelling and interpreting building regulations and knowing how to apply them, for example. But there's a ton of other things which have helped as well. This whole community is online, which spend their time looking at satellite imagery and doing geolocations of videos, and there's a huge amount of domain knowledge amongst those communities who can help you to learn how to interpret satellite imagery of a place that you're perhaps not familiar with. And certainly there were some fantastic people, for example, at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute who helped a lot when I was starting to get to grips with Xinjiang. There's people like the Tactical Technology Collective who do a lot of training in open source investigations, and they have a lot of resources online, and they run conferences and workshops. LNCAT has a voluntary program. They have a lot of online resources in how to do work similar to this, and they also run trainings. I think that's, yeah, I mean, people like Amnesty International are also increasingly working in this field too, and they have volunteer opportunities, which can be a great way to start to build up skills. I'll leave things there, and maybe we can move to the Q&A.
Thank you both for completely fascinating and often horrifying stories. Well, mainly always horrifying stories, actually. So very, very serious and incredible work that you've both been taking part in and instigating. To go to Sarah first, I've lots of questions actually about the sort of techniques and the technology. Both Jack and Julian asked sort of what sort of tools are you using? I was wondering, listening to you, there's such a rich variety in both of your work, actually, the different sort of things that you pull together to create a body of work and an investigation. And Sarah, I was wondering, you spoke very eloquently about the lived experience of the people there, the local knowledge. Is there some kinds of experience, some kind of data from investigations that are much harder to find the tools to represent when you're putting together a project? I mean, the picture of people on the beach was very compelling, that actually people are there living on that site with not only the layers of archaeology, but actually the sort of bombardment and what they're having to go through. So are there some sort of sets of data that are much harder to integrate into the narrative?
I mean, in terms of integration, I mean, I think Alison also spoke about this in her presentation as well, that there are, you know, I think with sites like the one that Alison showed and like others that we have worked on at Forensic Architecture, there are sites that are quite inaccessible. And I think it's often, you know, it can be a challenge that I think we particularly did a project on the Sednaya prison in Syria, which I think also uses a number of kind of similar techniques to what Alison was showing, where we were interviewing former detainees. And I know that for that project, for us, one of the challenges was we were very used to working with images. And so that was a question about what to do when there are no images. And I think often those kind of filling in the gaps of when we don't have those images, and exactly, I think as Alison was showing well, this kind of process of kind of using models, especially, and sort of using those models, I think, to fill in those gaps, and to use them as a way of synthesizing what is often going to be very fragmented information. And AL calls it open verification, this kind of idea that we particularly use modeling in order to, as I say, to synthesize all of those different types of material. So, you know, you might have a little video clip that captures one little part of something, and you might have another image here, and then you may have, you know, testimony either through speaking to people on the ground directly or through Twitter or, you know, social media or wherever the information is coming from. And if you took any one piece of evidence, it would be very hard to construct a kind of full narrative and to get a full picture. And so what we'll often do, as I was showing with the kind of different ways that we use these fragmented images and all this different material to put something coherent together, I think that's often the kind of challenge is to take all these different pieces and bits, and this sort of idea of verification plays in here, because I think I get often asked, you know, sort of how do you spot, you know, do you know how to spot deep fakes, or, you know, there are all these ways of, you know, kind of making up information or distorting information. And I think the idea of open verification is that you don't rely on any one piece of evidence. You're using local knowledge, you're using different forms of expertise, you're using different kind of spheres of expertise, you're using all these different materials. And if that, by using all of those different things, if any one thing is wrong or off or fake or whatever it is, then you still have this kind of solid base of evidence. And that's the sort of production of evidence and the presentation of evidence, and using models in that way to reconstruct an incident or a space.
Thank you. I mean, that's so interesting to hear how thorough and sort of cross-checked the investigation has to be. And Alison, that made me think of the kind of incredible but really sort of sensible thinking that surely an architect would bring to a project like yours, where you talked about the tender documents being available and being useful, and also the employment adverts as being sort of useful data. I mean, you're an architect, you spoke about how you sort of got into it. Was there a very particular perspective you had on these projects, that a very particular way of thinking that allowed this to really very literally take shape?
I mean, the skills that I have like lend themselves well to certain like avenues of investigation. So as I said in the presentation, like satellite imagery was one that Mega was talking to me about, how there were all these camps spread across this region that very few had been found. It was very difficult to go there, and I was like, in fact, she had already started using satellite imagery to do that. The first camp, the one that she actually visited, had been shown to her by somebody in Kazakhstan, and somebody had showed her on Google Maps where this place was, and she'd been able to go and visit. So she had already been thinking about that. And then I came along and sort of had those skills to be able to take that a bit further. And then, definitely once we'd started to find those places, certain avenues of investigation started to suggest themselves, that I knew that these places would have been built to plans, that there would have been regulations that would have guided how they would be built, and that we could go and look for those, and that could form a really useful like key, which could help us to like unlock what it was that we were looking at. Yeah, I mean, I should say, of course, like we also built on the work of other researchers. In fact, those tender documents had first been found by Adrian Zenz and then a researcher called Sean Zhang, and they had done that first work of finding the first camps, and then which we then built on. But yeah, for sure, sort of, and then to move into modelling as we did in Mongol Kure, and having the skills to be able to do that, and then combine that with like Mega's huge amount of experience in interviewing, that she was able to then take that model and go to a group of detainees and sort of have like really fruitful conversations about their experience using that, and also bring useful information back to me that would allow them to take that further. So yeah.
And Cesare is asking about funding for projects. I mean, I guess somehow this needs to be able to happen, and work needs to be funded, and I'm sure that's challenging with this kind of project. Could you both just say a few words on how these projects get funded? Is that part of the work that you need to put into getting these projects off the ground?
Sure, I can maybe go first. Most of my work is grant funded. In the case of the Xinjiang work, it was funded by the Open Technology Fund. And then after that, we also had funding from IBEAM Centre for the Future of Journalism. We've had funding from the Pulitzer Centre, and we've had funding from the International Women's Media Fund as well. And now I have funding from BuzzFeed at the moment. BuzzFeed was also paying for Mega's time throughout. So that's how we funded this.
That's good to know. Thank you. And Sarah?
Yeah, we are largely grant funded as well, but it's kind of a sort of collage of different funding sources. We have kind of, because we're part of a university, we have some academic funding, primarily from the AHRC, the European Research Centre. We also have kind of other sorts of private human rights funders, like the Sigurd Rousing Trust, the Oak Foundation, Open Society Foundations. We will occasionally get funding also from other sort of NGOs. We do sort of commissioned projects in a sense, where people will commission us to undertake independent research, and often in partnership with those groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, these types of organizations. And then we do have some funding as well from the exhibition and acquisition of our work in museums and galleries.
Brilliant. It's great that this work can carry on. There's so many questions coming in. I'm going to have to sort of apologize and say we probably won't get through them all. Olivia and Salam were asking about, could projects, particularly the Gaza project, could they be made more interactive and participatory for people in Gaza to contribute to? I mean, I guess that's the challenge of both of the work that you're doing, isn't it? How I mean, that's the premise of our exhibition as well. It's thinking through making, and the idea that a project, that the making of a model is really important in the end project. So when you have a sort of finished project, how important is it to you both that it's very readable? I mean, obviously it's a very strongly visual project. So yeah, Sarah, how important is the fact that it's visually understandable? It would have to be sort of, I mean, the forensic architecture models are beautiful to look at, even though they're telling a very disturbing truth. How important is the sort of the narrative and the interactive nature of a model in the sort of planning of a project?
Absolutely. I mean, actually, there's just one thing I wanted to say before I get to answering your question, which I forgot to say at the beginning of my presentation. But the Gaza project that I showed, we've not yet published that project. This was a little preview for everybody who was able to attend today. But I would just ask if everybody wouldn't mind. I think the project's going to be published very soon, but if everyone would mind not posting anything about it on social media, or just any kind of images of the project, that would be much appreciated by us. But as I say, it should be out very soon. So hopefully it'll shortly be public, which actually leads, I guess, to the answer to that question, which is that, I mean, I think the aesthetic dimension of the work, and when I say aesthetic, I mean, there's the look of the work, but there is aesthetics in the sense of presentation, and how evidence is presented is really very much a kind of core tenet of what FA does. And I mean, I think this is largely due to the fact that the team is made up of kind of visual practitioners, of architects, of video editors, of people who have a very kind of keen aesthetic sensibility. And I think also a lot of it is about making the work, you know, presented in a way that is engaging and easy to understand, in that it often possibly has to serve multiple functions. It may need to be that it's engaging and that it has to tell a very particular narrative, and also to present to the way that it's presented needs to be precise and to be sort of forensic in a sense, and to be specific, and for people to be able to understand. I think some of the, you know, often in the way that kind of traditional human rights work, but also, you know, legal documents and things like that, you know, you may get a public inquiry which publishes, you know, a 3,000-page report on an incident that's happened. And for the people, particularly for the families and the survivors, say, of a particular incident, to read through that 3,000-page report and try to make sense of, okay, well, if someone was mentioned on page 24 who was in place A at time X, and you know, their neighbor was on page, you know, 326, and they were also at that place, and how to possibly make sense of all of that. And I think to be able to put it into a way that is visual and is understandable and kind of shows the way that the research was done, and to show that in a way that's accurate, that's precise, that's engaging, that tells the stories of people who want their stories to be told, I think is very, very important, and really kind of it is in every part of the work. It doesn't just come at the end. It's not just like, okay, well, how do we make a film about what we've done? The whole work is going towards that that presentation.
Yes, and I suppose, Alison, the work that you're doing, the sort of visualization is the sort of the truth that you're sort of offering up, isn't it, to the project? You're making visible what is being denied. So how did you sort of think about, I mean, the visualizations of the project are the story in itself. Did you have to sort of think about how you were going to share that work, or how it would look or be delivered?
Yeah, of course. So this work has been published in BuzzFeed. In BuzzFeed News. We started publishing in August 2020, and then we continued publishing that series until, like, the last piece was earlier last summer, and was looking at the capacity of the camps. You know, we're still working on Xinjiang now, but it's really been about, you know, we have many of the same concerns as Sarah does, you know, like how do we tell that story in a way which is effective? How do we tell it in a way which is very clear, which brings together, you know, the huge amount of information that we've pulled together in our reporting and makes that available to the public? I mean, one other thing that we've worked really hard on is trying to sort of show like multiple aspects of what's happening. So, for example, when we started work, it was known that this camp system existed, although policymakers typically lacked evidence for what was happening. But what was really missing was like a sense of the scale of the camps program. And so finding the full network and showing that full scale was something that was really, really important to us. But then at the same time, we wanted to show the human side, because that's how you show what this actually means, that there are these camps spread across the region, that there were 1 million people detained. And so we worked very hard to bring those two things together, to tell these sort of in-depth personal stories of people who had been through this ordeal in the camps and what had happened to them. And at the same time, show the scale, show how that interacted with policy moves from the Chinese government. To show how that program had changed and expanded over time, and to really try and bring those multiple aspects together. And then in addition to the articles on BuzzFeed, we also published all of the data, and that's, you know, partly so that people can go and check it if they want to, and it's about adding to the credibility of what we've done, but it's also so that other researchers can, and activists and communities can go and build on that information that we've put out there.
Yes, that's really interesting. Thank you. Our co-curator of Shaping Space, Simona Valeriani, has sent a message across. So archaeologists and architects bring different skills to these inquiries. Some architects have used building archaeology methodologies to reconstruct and document World War II crimes against humanity. In which way is training in architecture specifically useful as a background to this kind of work? And that echoes what a lot of people have been saying in the Q&A, actually. How, you know, this is so fascinating, and as a young architect, how can you actually, you know, get into doing this kind of work? Any tips for young architects that might be watching, or older ones? Actually, it's never too late to switch direction. Is there sort of a specific training, or maybe another, you know, like archaeology, another sort of profession that you could to look to?
I mean, I guess, like I tried to say at the end of my talk, I mean, there's a lot of skills that that people develop during architectural education, and in fact also during architectural practice. I wouldn't say that this is just for people who are just getting out of university. There's also like huge value in people who've been in practice for a number of years and built up experience. I'm starting to do this work. But, you know, certainly like all of the modeling techniques and the modeling software and the knowledge of that, things that have served me really well are just skills that are useful in architecture and which are really developed through that training, which is things like the ability to move quite easily between 2D and 3-dimensional representations of objects and of the world. And I tried to point to some resources that people could use. Tactical Technology Collective is one. Bellingcat has some great resources online as well. I would encourage people to check those out. And, you know, forensic architecture, of course, has a lot of work online.
Brilliant. I mean, a lot of the Q&A questions are, please tell me how to do this. Which tools should I be using? What technologies are best employed to use this kind of work? But I guess that can people look to both of your sort of websites to get more information on the sort of technologies and tools?
I mean, at BuzzFeed, we actually published a lot of, when we published the first article in our series about like, here's the full network of camps, we published a long how-to and explained how we did all of the work as well. I would also point out that a lot of the tools that we use are very, very accessible, in that they're free to use. You know, the majority of the work that I've done has been with Google Earth, which is free software. We use the desktop version, which you can download, and that gives you lots of access to historical imagery and measurement tools. We use tools like Sun Calculator, SunCalc, to look at shadows and to measure things, to do our photogrammetry. Yeah, the European Space Agency has a huge amount of tools online for free. Those have been a lot of the big ones, really.
Brilliant. And because we're drawing to an end now, it's getting close to our finish time. I wanted to ask you both about impact of these projects, both sort of how you measure the sort of positive and negative impact, and ways that you've seen this change the lives of people that you're representing. Yeah, just to ask you both about sort of the positive impact these projects have had and what you hope to gain from your crucial investigations. So Sarah, first.
I mean, I think it varies so much between each investigation. Each investigation will have a kind of also from the beginning, one case that we take on may be specifically geared towards building evidence towards a legal case, a court case. And in those instances, I mean, I think that's when the win and the lose is very clear. We win the court case, and our evidence has in some way contributed to that. I think that is very clear. I think one of our kind of, I guess, our greatest sort of successes on that front was, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. It's all, the last 2 years are all a blur, but there was the Golden Dawn trial in Greece in particular, where a number of the kind of leaders of Golden Dawn, which is a far right kind of neo-Nazi group in Greece, were on trial for a kind of wide range of criminal activity, and particularly a number of those people were members of the Greek Parliament, and the Golden Dawn was actually a party which held seats in Greek Parliament, and we contributed to one particular case, which was the murder of a young man in Athens, Pavlos Visas, who was quite vocal in his kind of opposition to this neo-Nazi group. And that case, I mean, not in any way at all entirely because of our evidence, but we did contribute to that particular element of what was a massive case in Greece. But to have kind of been successful, or to have been part of the success of that case in bringing some sense of justice and accountability, I think to those, particularly to his family who had suffered. I think there's many different measures of accountability and justice, and I think also sometimes it's a matter of advocacy. Sometimes it's a matter of in some projects it's about working with particular communities or individuals where having their story told and having it told in such a way that it's going to be heard, I think can be a huge measure of success for us. But I think it depends on the case and on what we set out to do.
Brilliant, thank you. And Alison?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm speaking mostly about this one specific issue, that of Xinjiang. So, I mean, like I said, when we started out, the world just really lacked evidence of what was happening in Xinjiang. And so that was what we were interested in trying to provide. Showing where the camps were, sort of confirming that the estimates of detainee numbers that had emerged really were likely. Publishing sort of stories of the people who had been through the camps so that people could understand what was happening inside these places, showing what was happening with forced labor in there and the connections of that forced labor in Xinjiang to Western markets and Western brands. Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of things happening over the past couple of years. Of course, that's on the basis of a combined effort of journalists and researchers working on this. But we've seen a number of countries make a determination that what's happening in Xinjiang is a genocide. And the latest was France, which was just today, but also the US and the UK, amongst others. And that brings a responsibility to act. We've seen diplomatic boycotts of the Olympics, which are going to start in just a couple of weeks. We've seen sanctions of key people within the Chinese Communist Party who are seen to be particularly responsible for what's happening. And we've seen economic sanctions around the goods which are coming out of Xinjiang, the cotton and the tomatoes, and also, you know, the electronic goods and solar panels, which are, you know, many of those goods we have strong reason to believe are connected to forced labour. So we are starting to see action from the international community around what's happening.
Yeah, that's brilliant to hear. Thank you both so much for your incredibly fascinating, quite often harrowing, but really important and brilliant work. It was a pleasure to talk to you both this evening. So thank you to Sarah, to Alison, and to Harriet for the introduction. Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Harriet, for having us, and thank you to everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all the questions, but I'm happy to take this conversation to Twitter if anyone would like to. And thank you so much for coming in and hearing about our work.
Thank you. It was a privilege and a pleasure for us. Good night.
Good night.